This is The Download from Sounds Profitable, your daily source for the essential news of the business of podcasting. Brought to you by Spreaker from iHeart. I'm Newton Shalakati. Here's what you need to know for today, Wednesday, December 4th. First up, paywalling podcast journalism. Today, Adam Shepard, former editor of PodPod, announced he is stepping away from podcast coverage to work in a different section of Haymarket Media Group, the parent company that merged PodPod into Campaign in February of this year. After the announcement of the PodPod brand being dissolved, podcast industry coverage appears to have dried up at Campaign, and what does exist is paywalled, a growing trend in podcast coverage. Yesterday, Ashley Carman's Soundbite newsletter, a source of a fair bit of breaking industry news, announced new issues are now paywalled behind Bloomberg subscription. Sounds Profitable wouldn't exist without the support of and free access to Pod News. We encourage you to subscribe and consider supporting Pod News, as we all have. In addition to Sounds Profitable sponsoring Pod News as a company, we as individuals have also pledged to the Pod News Patreon to support the continued publication of podcast industry coverage. Next up, the case for increased investment, breaking down the barriers behind the audio investment gap. WARC has published a new report made in partnership with Audacy that looks into the audio investment gap, a noticeable gulf of difference between the large share of consumption audio content gets versus the small share of advertising spend the industry gets. Key findings include audio accounting for 24.5% of ad-supported media consumption, but just 8.4% of ad spend in the US. A large perceived barrier to podcast advertising is the idea measurement and modeling is not ready yet, which the report finds is untrue. Next up, hear those bells? Spotify Wrapped is here, and this has multiple sources. It's the week after Thanksgiving in the US, which means it's time for Spotify Wrapped, a yearly tradition in the app that shows users how much they listen to certain artists, genres, specific songs, and podcasts. This year's edition of Wrapped comes with extra details shared by Spotify, such as the top 10 breakout podcasts of the year, which means Business Insider has now discussed Talk to A, and top shows overall. In addition to the usual data tidbits, this year, Spotify has employed Google's Notebook LM tool to use generative AI to make a bespoke podcast where two AI hosts discuss your listening habits throughout the year. Next, 5 million new Canadian adults have become monthly podcast listeners since 2019, by Matt Heard. Signal Hill Insights began tracking Canadian podcast listening in 2017 with the Canadian Podcast Listener Report. The latest edition finds that in the past 5 years, monthly podcast listenership has risen from 26% of Canadian adults to 39%. Taking into account population growth, that rise means there's 5.1 million more monthly podcast listeners in the country than there were in 2019. Even with the growing population, podcast listeners are trending younger, more affluent, and more educated than the average Canadian adult, making them a group with both high purchasing power and plenty of time to become long-term consumers. And finally, global ad spend forecasts for December 2024. A new report from Dentsu finds that even with 2025 not having the advertising boosts that were the 2024 Olympics and US election season, next year is forecasting ad spend increase in the US, with audio ad spend in particular showing resilience with an 8.1% increase next year. Podcasting specifically is predicted to grow 5.3% in 2025, given audio's growth is tied to digital and generates high attention. As for the rest of the news, Wondery is offering select access to video podcasts through their Wondery Plus app. Apple has shared its Podcast of the Year, Hysterical, with Dan Taberski from Wondery and Pineapple Street Studios. Podcast marketing platform Ausha has announced the expansion of its AI search tool Ausha Intelligence, and Jay Green is now EVP of Business Strategy and Partnerships at QCode. Be sure to check out the links to every article mentioned right in your podcast listening app or at soundsprofitable.com, where you can also subscribe to the newsletter version. The Download is written and produced by me, Newton Shalakati, Brian Barletta, Gavin Gaddis, and Tom Webster. This episode is hosted on Spreaker. For Sounds Profitable, I'm Newton Shalakati. Download us again tomorrow.